Well, it is January 5th. We are online, and I am here talking to.
Tapp.
And which organization are you speaking for?
The IWW.
So tell us a little bit about what the IWW is and what it does.
Historically, the IWW was founded in January of 1905. It was started as a response to the trade union conglomerate, the American Federation of Labor. What was happening is that you have a lot of immigrants coming in, and you have a lot of unskilled workers. American unions were basically set up for native workers, being not Native American ethnically, but people who were citizens, people who were white, um, men, and skilled labor, and they were trade unions, craft unions, trade unions. There's a difference, but they weren't as effective as they could have been if you if you organized the workers in an entire industry, and if you had men and women and no racial discrimination and no discrimination on skill. So the IWW was founded to do that, and it was extraordinarily effective. In fact, so effective that they organized what were called the Palmer Raids to shut it down in 1919, and it struggled through the 20s and almost fell apart in the 30s. But in the 30s, a rebirth of the IWW came about with what they call the CIO, the Council of Industrial Organizations, and it's basically the IWW. But that was the foundation for the union upswing in the 30s, and then World War II came, and the IWW struggled through that, got very small, and the 90s really saw a massive rebirth, and that's continued on into today. In fact, the past few years has seen doublings of the membership and so forth. It's not a political organization. It is a union, an industrial union.
Mhm. So after more than 100 years of existence, what makes the IWW's message still relevant today?
The IWW is set up to advocate for the rights of working people, and it's meant to fight for a classless society, a new society.
Mm.
And I think that the vision of that is a primitive vision, a futuristic vision, but I think it's a goal that we carry with us as humans. You know, a goal of a hierarchical society, a social political pyramid that keeps some people down, I think is antithetical to our dreams, really.
Mm. What inspired you to join the IWW?
Um, my grandfather had been a communist in the mines in
Mm.
Kentucky, and I bounced around to different places. But in the 90s, late 90s, I moved back to Kentucky from, I was living in Cincinnati and then New York City, and I moved back to Kentucky, and I got a lot of really terrible jobs and got screwed over on them. And I knew from talking with my grandfather and from some reading that there were techniques we could use to organize. So uh, I started using those, and I found out from a little zine store that the IWW had become very active again. There was a paper that still comes out, but I don't know if it's printed. I just get an email. It was called the Industrial Worker, and
Mm.
from there I found a delegate, you know, joined.
Okay. You talked about techniques and tactics of organizing. What kind of tactics and actions does the IWW use to build workers' power?
Well, it's easy to contrast them with what most business unions in the U.S. advocate.
Mm.
A lot of business unions in the U.S. advocate a very bureaucratic approach to building power on the job. So you talk to people, you get them interested in a union, you get them to sign cards saying I would like to be in a union. A business agent talks to them, an organizer, and you eventually have an election through the National Labor Relations Board. It's a very, very regimented process. The IWW, you do what people have done before when unions were still completely illegal, and that is you slow down work,
Mm,
or you work by every rule given to you, which will almost destroy the business, or you stop working, or you walk out, but you stick together. And by sticking together, you're already the union. I've been involved with campaigns where um, you you don't end up with an actual union, quote unquote, but you
mhm.
have a de facto union that gets all the results you wanted.
Okay.
Within that context, the point of the IWW and the point of anarcho-syndicalist unions and all of this that was very explicit 100 years ago is that by doing this, by standing up for other people and working outside of the profit motive, uh, you're actually constructing a new world as you do this. That
Mhm,
if you have a classless society or just a better world, you look back on these actions and you see that those were formative actions.
mhm. Um, Now you mentioned that the organization had grown since the 90s. What do you think is responsible for new interest in the IWW?
Uh, I think that's a mix of things.
Mm,
Back when I was a kid, there was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was paraded uh, accurately and inaccurately as the left, and its existence had an effect on U.S. policy. So there was an attempt to better ourselves, and a contrast with the Soviet Union, which wasn't as racist, which wasn't as sexist, which wasn't plagued by income inequality, which didn't have unemployment, which didn't have homelessness, which didn't have hunger. And so when you see us, you could point to this and say, this is what we could have. When it fell, it unfettered U.S. capitalism.
mm,
So U.S. capitalism became much worse, much more toxic. Reagan initiated that as well with neoliberalism, and so you're returning to a set of conditions and dynamics that you had in 1905,
mm.
in that era.
So how does the syndicalist vision of the IWW kind of differ from or is similar to the Soviet Union?
That's a The Soviet Union really. It's hard to say what that was. It uh,
Mm,
it ended up at times having a lot of benefits to it, as for the average person. And we're not taught that in the U.S. I understand, so it sounds very contradictory. There were awful times too, like Stalin's gulags, and
mm,
trials, which weren't as extensive as we were told. I've actually done research in this, but any of them, just the existence of that is horrible. I mean, we
mm,
had political prisoners too, but still, um, the Soviet Union was a very complicated thing, and it changed over time. Like the U.S. in 1804 or 1940 or 2020, these were different entities. So um, it doesn't like the Soviet Union had a series of workers' councils, and those are the Soviets, and the Soviets would have functioned in a very syndicalist fashion, but Lenin actually shut them down once he took power, which tells you like something very anti-worker was taking place.
mm.
So that's very complicated.
I see. Coming back to the
I
US a
just meant
bit.
not to
Oh yeah.
not to
No,
interrupt you,
go
but
ahead. Yeah.
the thing is, my point on that was that Reagan came into power, and one of the first things he did was destroy the PATCO, the Air
Mm,
Traffic
yeah.
Controllers Union strike, to show that labor was now going to be on its back. And then you have the fall of the Soviet Union, which, like I said, was always a contrast. And once you have no contrast and no other parent to whom you can point to say like we could be doing this, then it takes the chains off of the ugliness of American capitalism even more so.
Right.
So that was my point, not to compare the IWW to it. But the IWW did have a relation. There was a boat of sailors that stopped by Seattle, I think in 1919,
Mm.
and were greeted by IWW people who wrote a letter to Lenin, who actually wrote back. He stood for many good things, even though a very complex, contradictory figure.
Returning to the US a bit, you mentioned how the IWW differed from traditional unions like the AFL.
Right.
But what do you think? Why have unions like the AFL become too bureaucratic or unable to serve workers' interests accurately today?
Well, their ability to advance workers' rights, which I hate that term because it sounds like something very specific. And workers is essentially all of us, except for big time owners, the wealthy. But to advance our rights, the trade unions were always shackled with problems. The problem with a
Mhm.
trade union is if you're a carpenter, you could be a member of the carpenters union, but you might be working for a business that has carpenters, welders, um, painters. So if the carpenters go on strike, other people in the business are still functioning. It's not industrial, it's trade. And
Mhm.
also, after the 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 height of strikes in this country was in 1946, 1947, and it was that time when you had a very big communist party, two very big socialist parties, remnants of the IWW, but especially the CIO, that there was a decision made. I mean, this is a conspiracy theory. It was a conspiracy, but it's very documented and explicit, and it was to destroy the labor leaders. And the labor leaders all uh, were either communists or friendly to the idea of communism. So that's the communist witch hunts. And once those are pushed are enacted, or as they're enacted, there were these laws enacted like Taft-Hartley and all types of the formation of the National Labor Relations Board that bureaucratized union action. You don't need to have these bureaucratic structures to have a union. A bureaucratic structure should enable and facilitate effectiveness, not slow
Mhm.
things down and encumber them. And that's what was going on and still is going on, a lot of union activity.
Mhm.
But it was a decision made by the imposition of those structures by the U.S. government.
So now, as we return kind of to the modern era, right? President Biden has tried to position himself as a friend of the workers, right? But how have his administration's policies impacted working people today?
Well, specifically, this decision about the railroad workers. I don't know if you're
Mm.
acquainted with that, but um, I think it's a horrible decision that came down. He basically prevented the railroad workers from going on strike. And that's very similar to what happened with Patco. There's
Mm.
still a lot of talk of a wildcat strike, an illegal strike, slowdowns, things like this. So it's not a fait accompli. But Biden is anything but a friend of working people,
Mhm.
and we should know this. I mean, Biden's got a really horrible policy record. He advanced a lot of corporate, specifically credit card interests as a senator from Delaware.
Now, since the advent of neoliberalism under Reagan, Bush, Clinton, especially as we enter the 21st century, in this period, do you think conditions for workers are getting better or worse, and why?
Much worse,
Mm.
much worse. You have automation. You have a massive concentration of wealth. Um, Here in New York, you have uh, rampant wage theft. Um, you have the attempt by it's hard to call them corporate leaders or governmental leaders. They're blended so much, but
Mm.
you have an attempt to keep down wages and worker power. I think it's terrible, and I think that's why you're seeing so much interest among young people in structures that were effective 100 years ago, because these same tensions were abundant 100 years ago, and we're definitely going back there, if
Mhm.
not there already.
So what do you think are the most effective solutions to these problems?
The more people who understand that they actually do have power, uh, their power being the power to stop working, the power ultimately for what I think of as ultra violence, and that is
Mm,
the disruption of profit, not a gun, not a not a bomb, but stopping that flow of profit, which is what sustains the rulers, the wealthy. Um, when people understand that they can do that, and they can do that through stopping working, they can do that through stopping purchasing, they can do that through not paying their credit card bills. When they understand that the system depends on them, uh, that's the most effective thing we can do. And the IWW, most of its methods are to empower people to do just that.
mhm,
You can at work, if you simply just don't, if you're being mistreated in whatever many ways, you could just fail to participate, and the whole thing will stop. I've been on construction jobs where there have been threats, and there have been one time they were keeping us over and not paying us overtime. You just put your tools down. you know
mm,
you can't you could try and hire one person to go and force one other person to work. That's ludicrous, though. And before long, the situation will just topple. You can hire
mm,
cops to go and beat people like Occupy Wall Street, or the timber workers in World War I that were all IWW, and they threatened to they did bring soldiers in to do their jobs, and they couldn't do their jobs, and plus they're soldiers who's going to fight the war. you know
mm.
when you realize you have that power, you can act on it, and immediately things change.
So what does successful socialism or syndicalism look like to you?
um well, there have been areas of the world like the Pyrenees in the 30s, and places in Europe in the 20s, like different indigenous cultures, especially, um, where you have essentially the productive class in
Mm,
charge. And that's what it looks like to me. On a coming from rural, poor people, which I do, uh, there weren't rich people around, and there weren't owners. You just basically, well, there were, I mean, there was that too, but on a daily basis, you had chores. Everyone contributes, everyone eats from what you grow. Um, Ultimately, that's how things would look. The people who produce are the people who should reap the benefits. And you should have a society in which you don't have food here and hungry people here, or
mm,
healthcare here and sick people here, or unhoused people here in luxury apartments all around Central Park left vacant. That makes no sense at all,
mm.
except for profit.
Right. Now, what do you see as the future of the IWW? Where is it going?
Well, it's being filled with young people right now, and I think young people are totally screwed. Aside from climate change and the nightmares of that, um, all the forces are stacked against them. So I I think nothing's inevitable, but I see basically a future in which you have young people using these techniques to fight back and
Mm,
winning. I think the real question isn't whether we have a world benefiting the producers. I think we will have that this century. We almost, in part, had a semblance of it, with the Soviet Union at times, and at times totally not. But we've had a semblance of it. But we will have that. I think the main question is when young people are able to do these things, and they won't be young people then, unless
Mhm.
it's tomorrow, and it won't be, but it will be some tomorrow. The
Right.
question is, how do they view climate refugees and immigrants? Do they bear down on nationalities, or do they go internationals? And if they
Mm.
bear down on nationalities, it's a very right wing approach and ugly. If they're internationalists, globalists in that sense, I don't really like that word because it has connotation, but if they're internationalists and they open their arms to refugees and immigrants, it's very left wing. And that's what I would fight for. I think the unionizing and coming together as working people, it'll either happen or there won't be a species. I mean, the wealthy are so outrageously uh, toxic at this point. They have to be destroyed either by eliminating them as beings or eliminating them as wealthy people.
Mm.
Right now, Oxfam said that your average billionaire produces as much. How is this? Yeah, average billionaire produces as much toxic gas through their activities as a million people. That's an average person. So you're taking into account someone in Bangladesh who's
Right.
carbon innocent, and someone like me or another American who's very guilty. Um, but at the same time, your one billionaire is worth a million of us, and there are about 2,200 billionaires on the planet. So if you got rid of billionaires, not just the wealthy billionaires, that's worth
Mm.
2 billion people in terms of carbon emissions. So
Right.
this has to happen. And that I think right now you see more surveillance, more mega prisons being built, cops training for urban warfare, surveillance as an effort to stop this, to stop what the good thing that's coming. Good, um, good overall, but really good if it's internationalist and
Right.
acceptance.
Now, as we end off here, I just want to ask you a personal question. Um, so you're taking this interview from your studio. You are an artist.
Right.
Um, how has your work in the IWW or building workers' power kind of influenced your artistic direction?
Um, it's very complicated. I think the one thing that I have noticed is in going to in exhibiting and talking with other artists, most artists come from a upper middle class background or above.
Mm.
Very, very few of us come from um, a poor or lower income background,
Right.
and I think it really affects how you feel about your work and how you feel about the audience. The content is a very complicated question, but like I have a project right now that I'm just dealing around with. I haven't really started it, but I've done a lot of portraits, and I did portraits of people at work, and I would like to actively go to people at work and people in the street and do portraiture. In selling, I won some major awards with my portraits, and several people pointed out that that you know very rarely do you have portraits of people who aren't paying for them and paying big
Mhm.
money for them, which
Right.
I've done some on commission as well. But to have you know, I hate the word average person, but the average person or the working person or person at work, uh, painted and honored in that way, valorized. That's something you don't see. You did at one
Mm.
time. You did, with socialist realism, and you did with some of the artists who were anarchists or socialists or proto-communists in the Impressionists, like Pizarro, Van Gogh,
Mm.
people like that. You see some of that, but you really don't see that today at all. Art has become just commodities, and like I said, people in the upper middle class and above uh, participating.
All right. Well, if you could leave the audience with any closing thoughts or places where they can find more information on the IWW.
You can go to IWW.org, but you can actually you can look up ICL too. There are international working persons associations, syndicalist associations that were very big 100 years ago that have been rebirthing. And the ICL is a young person's, it's all young people putting this together. It's a very serious refounding of these international working persons organizations. And I think that ultimately that's the way to go.
All right. Well, thank you very much.